Right now, something is happening that has never happened before in the history of the planet. 48 teams, 3 different countries, 16 cities spread across an entire continent, 104 matches crammed into 39 days, over 1,000 players, and somewhere north of 5 billion people, more than half of everyone alive, are going to watch at least part of it. This is the 2026 World Cup, and by every number you can measure, it is the biggest single sporting event the human race has ever attempted to stage. But here's the part almost nobody tells you. This exact tournament, the most watched event on Earth, the thing entire nations stop for, very nearly died at birth. The first time anyone tried to hold a World Cup, it was such a hard sell that most of the best teams on the planet flatly refused to show up. One king had to threaten to shut down a company just to get his own players on the boat. The referee in one match blew the final whistle 6 minutes early, and the trophy was carried across the ocean by hand in a piece of luggage. So how do you get from there, a tournament nobody wanted to travel to this, to 48 nations and half the planet watching at once? That's the story, and it's a stranger one than you think. Rewind almost 100 years. It's 1930, and a Frenchman named Jules Rimet has a slightly insane idea. A single tournament where the best national teams on Earth come together and play for one trophy, a world championship of football. There's just one problem. Nobody's totally convinced it'll work. The host is Uruguay, and on paper, that makes sense. They're the best team in the world at the time, 2-time Olympic champions, and they've built a brand new stadium specifically for the occasion. They even offer to cover the travel and hotel costs for anyone who shows up. It is, basically, the most generous invitation in the history of sport. And most of Europe says no. Here's why. In 1930, you couldn't fly to South America. To get from Europe to Uruguay, you had to board a boat and sail across the Atlantic Ocean for roughly 2 weeks. Each way. That's a month of travel, minimum, on top of the tournament itself. And remember when this is. The world is sliding into the Great Depression. These players aren't pampered millionaires. They have ordinary jobs. Taking 2 months off to sail to the far side of the world isn't a dream. It's a good way to come home and discover someone else is doing your job now. So the Giants stayed home. Italy didn't come. Spain didn't come. Germany and Austria, 2 of the strongest football nations on the continent, didn't come. England wasn't even a member of FIFA at the time, so they weren't part of any of it. And this is where you get the first story that sounds completely made up, but isn't. One of the few European teams that did go was Romania. And the reason they went is one man, the country's brand new king, Carol II. He was football obsessed. He'd just taken the throne, and one of his very first acts as king was to grant a blanket amnesty to every Romanian player who'd been suspended from the game, basically wiping the slate clean so he could pick the strongest possible squad. But he had a problem. More than half of his best players worked for the same English oil company. And when that company found out their employees wanted 3 months off to go play football on the other side of the planet, they said no, and warned the players that if they got on that boat, they'd have no job to come back to. So the king phoned the company's boss directly. And, depending on which version you believe, he informed him that if those players weren't given their time off, the king would simply shut the entire company down. The players got their 3 months. With a written guarantee, their jobs would be waiting for them. And the king personally picked the team. That is how Romania made it to the first ever World Cup, by royal blackmail. In the end, out of the entire continent of Europe, exactly 4 teams agreed to make the trip: France, Belgium, Romania, and Yugoslavia. 4. Several of them only confirmed at the very last minute. Romania literally squeaked in days before the deadline. Picture it. The first ever World Cup, the seed of the biggest event on the planet, and the European contingent is 4 reluctant teams crammed onto an ocean liner, sailing out of a little town on the French Riviera, stopping in Brazil on the way to pick up their squad, training on the deck of the ship because there was nowhere else to do it. The trophy itself was on board, brought along by Remet, carried basically by hand. 13 teams turned up in total, 7 from South America, 2 from North America, and those 4 brave or foolish Europeans. There was no qualification, no group of death, no global television deal. You were in because you bothered to come. And honestly, It worked anyway. On the 13th of July, 1930, a French player named Lucien Laurent swung his leg at a bouncing ball against Mexico and scored, and without knowing it, became the answer to a trivia question for the rest of time. The man who scored the first goal in World Cup history. But the first tournament was gloriously rough around the edges. In one match, France were playing Argentina, Argentina were clinging to a 1-0 lead, and France were pushing for an equalizer, when the referee suddenly blew for full time. 6 minutes early. The players were halfway off the pitch, some reportedly already heading for the showers, before officials realized the mistake and had to drag everyone back out to finish the last 6 minutes. That actually happened at the World Cup. And the tournament's showpiece, the brand new stadium Uruguay had promised the world, wasn't even ready. Heavy winter rain had wrecked the construction schedule, so the great Estadio Centenario didn't open its doors until 5 days into the World Cup. The opening matches of the entire competition had to be shoved into tiny club grounds instead, one of them with a capacity of around 1,000 people. The first World Cup, quite literally, kicked off before its main stadium was finished. And here's a detail that'll surprise an American audience especially. The team that reached the semi-finals at that first World Cup, the best finish in their entire history, was the United States. They got all the way to the Final Four before Argentina hammered them 6-1. The USA's greatest ever World Cup run happened at the very first one, 90-odd years ago. 2.5 weeks after that opening goal, in front of a packed crowd of around 93,000 in Montevideo, the hosts Uruguay beat their great rivals Argentina, 4-2, to become the very first world champions. There's even a legend that the two teams couldn't agree on whose ball to use, so they played one half with each. That was it. That was the entire first World Cup. 13 teams, a trophy in a suitcase, a king threatening businesses, a referee who couldn't read a clock, and a tournament so fragile that the best players in the world didn't think it was worth the boat ride. Now hold that picture in your head. 4 reluctant European teams on a ship, because we're about to fast forward and the contrast is going to be ridiculous. Because here's what happened next. The thing nobody wanted to travel to slowly turned into the thing nobody could afford to miss. It started small. Just 4 years later, in 1934, the World Cup moved to Europe, and suddenly everyone wanted in. So many teams tried to enter that. For the first time, they had to introduce qualification. You couldn't just show up anymore. You had to earn your place. The tournament settled on 16 teams, and it would basically stay that size, 16 teams, for almost 50 years. And that's the part that surprises people. For decades, through some of the most famous World Cups ever played, this was a 16-team event. Small, tight, exclusive. Entire continents barely got a look in. For a long time, Africa, Asia, and North America combined were lucky to share a single spot between them. So what broke it open? Politics. And it's a fascinating bit of business. In 1974, a Brazilian named João Havelange was running to become president of FIFA, the body that runs world football. And to win, he needed votes. Specifically the votes of all those smaller football nations in Africa and Asia who had spent decades locked out of the World Cup. So he made them a promise: vote for me, and I will expand the World Cup and give you more places at the table. They did. He won, and he had to deliver. The result was that, in 1982, the World Cup expanded to 24 teams, a huge jump, and for the first time, the tournament genuinely started to look global. More nations from outside Europe and South America finally got a real seat. Then, in 1998, it jumped again to 32 teams, 8 groups of 4. And that's the version most people watching today grew up with. That 32-team format felt permanent. It felt like the natural, finished shape of the World Cup. For almost 30 years, that's just what a World Cup was. And underneath all of it is a simple engine that only ever pushes one way. Part of it is beautiful. Every time the World Cup expands, more countries get to dream. A nation that has never qualified in its entire history suddenly has a real path to the biggest stage on Earth. And for that country, just qualifying can mean more than winning some other trophy. And part of it is pure business. More teams means more matches, more host cities, more tickets, more sponsors, and more television money flowing in from every corner of the globe. The dream and the money point in exactly the same direction. Bigger. So, after 32 felt locked in stone, they went bigger again, and this time, They went further than anyone expected. Which brings us to right now, 2026, the biggest World Cup in history. And it's not even close. Start with the obvious one. 48 teams, not 16, not 32, 48. That's 16 more nations than the last tournament. An entire extra World Cup's worth of teams bolted on top. More countries are playing in this single tournament than competed in the first 5 World Cups combined. To fit them all, the whole shape of the tournament had to be rebuilt. And the way they did it is its own little drama. FIFA's first plan was 16 groups of 3 teams each. It sounded efficient. It was also quietly a disaster waiting to happen, because in a group of 3, the final 2 teams play knowing exactly what result they both need, which is a recipe for quiet little arrangements and dead, meaningless final games. After the chaos and drama of the 2022 group stage reminded everyone how good 4-team groups are, FIFA scrapped the plan and went back to the drawing board. What they landed on is this: 12 groups of 4 teams each. The top 2 from every group go through, plus the 8 best third-place teams, and they all funnel into a brand new knockout round that has never existed before in the entire history of the World Cup. A round of 32. And that little detail, the 8 best third-place teams, quietly changes the whole tournament, because it means you can finish third in your group, you can actually lose games, and still advance to the knockout stage. A team can stumble through the opening round looking ordinary, sneak in as one of the best losers, and go on a run. For a channel that loves an underdog, that is a beautiful loophole. The raw numbers are almost comical. The old World Cup was 64 matches. This one is 104. It runs for 39 days. It involves over 1,000 players, each of the 48 teams naming a 26-man squad, the largest rosters in World Cup history. It is, by a wide margin, the most football ever squeezed into a single tournament. And here's the number that ties the whole story together. The 2026 World Cup isn't just the biggest in history. It's the richest event the sport has ever produced. It's projected to generate somewhere in the region of $11 billion, making it, by some distance, the most lucrative sporting tournament ever staged by anyone, anywhere. That fragile little gamble nobody wanted to sail to in 1930, the one with the unfinished stadium and the trophy in a suitcase, has become, by some measures, the single most valuable event on the planet. Now, is everyone happy about this? No. And it's worth being honest about that. Plenty of people think 48 teams is too many, that it waters the tournament down, adds lopsided mismatches, and piles even more games onto players who are already exhausted. Those are fair criticisms, but love it or hate it, the scale is simply unprecedented. And the part that really makes 2026 unlike anything before, it isn't even the teams, it's the map. Every previous World Cup had a host nation, one country putting on a show for the world. 2026 doesn't have a host nation, it has 3. For the first time ever, the World Cup is being co-hosted by 3 different countries at once: the United States, Mexico, and Canada. 16 host cities, 11 in the US, 3 in Mexico, 2 in Canada, stretched across almost the entire width of a continent. Think about what that actually means. Teams and fans aren't traveling across a country. They're crossing international borders, time zones, and thousands of miles, mid-tournament, just to reach the next game. It's less like a championship in one place and more like a championship draped across a third of the planet. And the tournament opens in the most perfect place it possibly could. The very first match, on the 11th of June, 2026, is held at the Estadio Azteca in Mexico City. And that stadium is a legend in its own right. The Azteca hosted the World Cup final in 1970 and again in 1986, the one where Diego Maradona happened. By kicking off 2026, it becomes the first stadium in history to host matches at 3 different World Cups, and the first ever to host 3 separate World Cup opening games. No other venue on Earth has done it even once. The Azteca has now done it 3 times. And then, at the very end, 39 days and 104 games later, it all comes down to a single match on the 19th of July, 2026, just outside New York City, at MetLife Stadium. One game. One trophy. The same trophy that, less than 100 years ago, was being carried across the ocean in a suitcase because barely anyone could be bothered to come. That's the leap, from 4 reluctant teams on a boat to 48 nations, 3 countries, and half the planet watching. So here's the thing worth sitting with. The World Cup didn't start as the biggest event on Earth. It started as a financial gamble that most of the best teams in the world didn't think was worth the trip. A tournament that needed a king's threats and a generous host just to fill out the field. It survived its own birth almost by accident. 13 teams, 1 stadium, a trophy in a bag. And then it grew and grew and grew until it became the one event that genuinely stops the entire human race at the same time. And 2026 is the largest version of that idea that has ever existed. More teams, more cities, more games, and more nobodies who were never supposed to be on this stage than any tournament in history. Which, when you think about it, is the best possible news. Because every one of those 48 teams is arriving believing, just for a moment, that this could be the year nobody saw them coming. And now, there are more of them than ever, with a brand new back door that lets you lose and still survive. The bigger the World Cup gets, the more room there is for exactly the kind of impossible story it was built on. It took 100 years and an ocean voyage to get here. And it's about to start all over again, bigger than it has ever been.